Tom has been in crypto for a really long time, and he's one of the most active bridge users, I would say. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Tom.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here. Over the long time follower of your writings and heavy user of your products as well too. So happy to get into it.
Yeah, I mean, let's just get started with an introduction of how you got started in crypto, because I've heard a lot of things about your stories in crypto and like outside of crypto. So please get started.
Yeah, by all means. So in 2014, so almost 10 years now, just about 10 years, I went and I took a job at a really small Bitcoin startup. I'd known about Bitcoin for a couple of years, just like as, a high school student, more or less. And I found some guy on AngelList he's like, I raised like $400,000 in like an open pitch night at one of these VC funds to do something in related to Bitcoin. I don't know what it is. I have no employees. Like, if you want to come work, come work. I need somebody who knows a lot about like, just like crypto. And like, I didn't even know that much, right? But like, I was on like Bitcoin Talk and stuff. So like, I was like, I knew the chains, I knew kind of what's going on. But granted, we went on to, it was called Coinify at the time. And it was, we did ICOs for projects essentially that were launched on Counterparty. So they were the old like XCP Counterparty, like ICOs. And I mean, they were ICOs back in the day when they would raise like, I don't know, $200,000, $300,000 in Bitcoin. Right. And that was like a massive success. And so I was like, kind of like product and like marketing guy for that. It was more like, I ran the Twitter. I like kind of knew how to talk to the crypto people, give or take. But I was super young, learned a ton about crypto from that. My boss at the time, actually back then, was super pilled on like the Ethereum future, which was still much more kind of blurry back then. But like in my like first week there, I remember him like sending me 5 articles to read by like Dan Larimer and like David Johnson and some of these like really early guys talking about they called them DACs, right? Back then, it's just a DAO, right? But decentralized autonomous corporation. And he's like, this is like the future, man. This is like what's going to happen. It's like DAOs and DACs and whatnot. And it was in hindsight, it was like, he was like right on the money and he was super early with it. So that was like pushed into my blood super early on into like my crypto life cycle. Right. And yeah, so I worked there for about a year and a half, 2 years. And, there was a small, I think we raised $1 million seed round. So it didn't last too long. Did a couple crowd sales. That company ended up more or less winding down. And I worked for a small Bitcoin startup for a couple months afterwards, until one day I got a call from who was a friend of mine that I met, kind of being around in San Francisco. His name's Joey. And he's like, hey, I need someone like, product and ops type guy, kind of like you, if you want to come work at Augur. And so I jumped on that pretty quickly, and I didn't expect it to necessarily last long. I had worked two prior companies within like a year and a half each. I'm like, oh yeah, it's like kind of a 1.5 year, 2 year gig. And I ended up staying at the Forecast Foundation there for about 7 years. So quite a long time. I like fell in love with prediction markets. They like very strongly pilled me on prediction markets and forecasting and, the idea of global decentralized permissionless markets on anything. And I started as like a product manager there. I did a bunch of just ops stuff behind the scenes as well. But I was just kind of I think I was one of the few like full-time engineers, on the team there. So I kind of just did the stuff that like wasn't engineering, more or less. But yeah, I did that for about 7 years, and that's where I got like the bulk of my, I would say, like crypto experience, knowledge, where a lot of my beliefs like really hardened and like started actually stemming from. And yeah, it was a great time, right? But so yeah, it's just I've been kind of working within crypto startups more or less for the last 10 years or so, on Twitter, on the forums, in all the chats, whatever, and yeah, then, maybe 2.5 years ago, me and a couple friends got together and we raised a little bit of money for something entirely unrelated to gas. And we talk about that after. And through the bear market, this last bear market, gas ended up being kind of a little side project that one weekend we kind of banged out for some different reasons. And a couple of months later, started getting some users, started getting some traction. And we kind of went full steam down this rabbit hole instead. So that's kind of where we're at now.
So lots of details there, right? Like you joined crypto in 2014, and at that point, I'm guessing it was just Bitcoin pretty much, because like the first two companies you worked at were Bitcoin related, and then you mentioned that Ethereum's idea was just being like spread around on Twitter. But then you ended up spending 7 years at Augur, right? 7 years at any company is a long time. 7 years at a crypto company is a really, really long time. So how was that experience in particular?
Yeah, it was wild because like the first couple of years was really more learning about Ethereum than it was learning about Augur and prediction markets. And then the kind of second half was really heavy on prediction markets. The human oracle, subjective human oracle, and kind of the theory and the mechanisms behind that. But I'd known about Ethereum, right? Like I was around like online when I unfortunately didn't participate in the Ethereum ICO. But I played with it like when it first came out and everything, and there wasn't too much to do. And I had been kind of exposed to those ideas from some of the prior people I had worked with, right? So I was like familiar. I was very familiar with Ethereum in the grand scheme of things, but I didn't really, and like I was very familiar and interested in the idea of just like the core decentralization and like the ethos of it, much stronger than I am today. I'm still very much like that, but I was even much more back then. But yeah, it was wild. The first couple of years was really like understanding Ethereum, understanding the ability to build a unstoppable application on top of this, and like what actually makes an application unstoppable, and then how that bleeds into like the architecture of actually building something, which is very hard, right? And also makes for a not very user-friendly product if you really want to take that to the furthest end of the spectrum, which is more or less what we tried to do. So understanding why you have to make all of these product and design decisions that to the outside person seem like the wrong decision, right? Like, oh, like you don't host your web application. You're like, why would you not do that? Like, how's anyone going to use it? And it's like, well, yeah, but if I host the web application, like, I can censor it. It's going to be the default point of contact. Somebody, takes over our DNS, like whatever. It's like, well, actually, if you want to do this, you have to publish software to the internet and let the people who want to use the software download it, build it, compile it, and run it, right? And like that's like the true ethos of like decentralized free open source software, right? But it makes for a very poor user experience. Yeah, absolutely, right? And that's like arguably the reason of why I think Augur never like won, right? Like the idea was there, it was on the right track and right lane, right? But if you do it and you like try to build it like Bitcoin, it becomes something that is almost near impossible for the average person to use, right? And in hindsight, there are a lot of people that act like the actual numbers of people that used it back in the day. I look at it occasionally now and I'm just like, I don't know who you sickos are, but like there was 400 or 500 people who like, downloaded the Ethereum state to their computer and like, ran an indexer and like got this thing up and running. In hindsight, it was like, oh, wow, there were actually some people out there who really tried to do it, right? But yeah, I think it really reinforced like the core ethos and ideas of Ethereum, building decentralized applications, why these things matter, when they matter, which like bleeds a lot into like a lot of the stuff we do now, right? Which is like everyone knows what decentralization is, and like we've moved into this world of decentralization as a spectrum now, right? And so it's like what makes sense to fully decentralize today, what doesn't, what requires decentralization, right? Like what is it actually good for? Just slamming something on a blockchain is not the correct answer, right? And like, but like actually understanding why. So it was very helpful long term in just I think my shaping of understanding crypto, Ethereum, Bitcoin, decentralization. Like the furthest end of the spectrum, decentralized apps, centralized apps, and somewhere in the middle, right? And like understanding today, even the stuff you see, right? The Solanas of the world, this of the world, the things that are in the middle of the spectrum, right? Being able to like properly assess what does this mean? What are the benefits? What are the trade-offs, et cetera, right? And like having a proper analysis and size of that. So yeah, it was one of the best learning experiences. While Augur didn't win, it was like the best learning experience I probably could have ever had for anything related to crypto.
I feel like your experience is just so different compared to someone like me who joined crypto in 2020. So I've never seen any of this, right? Like I've only seen, okay, there's Ethereum, there's a roll-up centric roadmap, there's Solana, Bitcoin is also there, which is the OG chain, but nobody really talks about it anymore from like an application development perspective. But like just listening to you, it felt like, okay, this is what Vitalik actually meant by cypherpunk, right? Like you guys were fighting the battle back then against the internet. Like right now we're talking about one chain against another chain, right? Like Ethereum versus Solana. But then how you were talking about Ethereum was versus the internet and how you would host an app on Ethereum instead of like building it on the internet, right? So it just felt like a totally different mental model for crypto that you have in comparison to something that I would have being someone who's just been here for like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. But it's like it's partially because like that is like what crypto like was slash still is to me, right? And I don't want to say we've like strayed from that. We've like matured, right? The entire ecosystem is just matured, and reasonably so, right? Some people forecasted and expected this kind of path of growth for the ecosystem, others not, right? But we knew much less even 2 or 3 years ago, right? Even when you do like 2020, right? Like we knew much less, and like we're learning new stuff every day about what we want to build, what is useful, what isn't useful, and that drives then what people go out and build and where these narratives shift and the products that like release and hit market and things, right? So it's I think it's just a natural evolution and maturity of this stuff, and like that is like the very like reaffirming thing is that we're not still in this mindset of what we were building 7 years ago. Because while it was cool, right? Like that stuff was really cool, and the stuff was like super strong on the ethos of a bunch of this stuff. It was relatively small in scope in the grand scheme of things, right? Partly because like we didn't know much more either, right? We didn't have these ideas invented, and like even Uniswap was like a massive unlock, right? Like an absolutely and like look at everything that has spawned in the rest of the ecosystem now, right? So we're still kind of like building and unlocking these primitives in real time, and it shifts the narratives and what people are interested in and everything like that. But yeah, this is like I think the gap between you'll see on Twitter occasionally with like some older people and some newer people where they're like, no, you have to care about the thing, and they're like, we don't care about the thing, we just like want to gamble on shit coins, right? And they're like, no, but you don't get it, like because like it's true, if you do this stuff properly, you do this stuff right. Like, and I'm still more bullish on it than ever, right? Like this technology will like absolutely change the world, and like it's going to change finance, it's going to change the way we transact, it's going to change the way everything, the effects of that, how that affects in the real world. Like it's like a no-brainer, right? And like I feel like sometimes we like don't talk about that enough, but like if you just like stop and zoom out for 1 second and like actually look at this, right? And it's just like, how does like decentralized global money not win? Like it obviously wins, right? Like when you like zoom out, like of course this obviously wins, right? And like whenever you get like, oh, Bitcoin boomer coin so boring, yada yada, right? And just like zoom out for a second, you're like, oh wait, no, this is actually like one of the coolest things that we've ever invented, and like obviously this wins in the long run, right? And we just have to like kind of grind through this like adoption, building, convincing, etc. phase that we're in right now, right? But even just the fact like we have an ETF now, like what? It's just like of course this is going to win. Of course Bitcoin's going to win. Like you can send money anywhere in the world, like immediately with no intermediary and like no state reserve. Like it's just like of course this wins. And the same thing with Ethereum and any sort of smart contracting chain or application, right? Programmable money is like absolutely unreal concept, and like the fact that we just have this at our fingertips today, like in our MetaMask, and like we can just do whatever we want with it. At some points, it seems like we take it for granted to some extent, right? But yeah, it's like obviously this stuff wins. Obviously, money not controlled by the state wins in the long run across the world, and the ability to program and autonomously interact with the world with this money is like just like so clearly the next better step of like the financial system, right? And like the way just finance works and the way money moves. So that's like it still keeps me around, right? You get jaded with a lot of things nowadays, but at like the root of it, it's obviously this stuff is going to win. Obviously, this is the future of like everything kind of finance and like technology related. So put your everything into it, survive, and like it's going to work out in the end.
Like there are so many narratives going around all the time on crypto Twitter, and every time there's a narrative, I start questioning things. How does it affect LIFI, or like how do we change? How do we deal with this now? So I go to Dom sometimes. Dom is the ecosystem guy at LIFI, and I ask him about some of these things, right? And he's like, "Go look at the DeFi OGs, right? Like these guys have been here for so long. They've seen so much that nothing really rattles them anymore. They're like hundreds of other people have done this before. This is also gonna blow off at some point, and then we're gonna get back on track at some point, right? So talking to you feels like a lot of that energy. And I want to know, like, how did you go from Bitcoin to playing around with Ethereum, and then now you're building something in Interop, right? Like, how did that change happen?
Yeah. On one page, doing like Interop stuff feels a lot like early Ethereum stuff, to be honest. It feels like kind of the next most interesting unlock that is like of such a large scale, right? But yeah, I first like really got bought in and sold on Bitcoin just from the kind of ethos and ideological like profile of it, which is decentralized, like stateless money, right? Particularly when I was younger, I was like, I really liked the idea of like, aha, like this is something that like the state can't come and touch, and like no matter what you do, you can't do anything about it, type thing, right? Which I still like, right? But that was very driven. And Ethereum was like the next master unlock, and my early understandings of it were a bit more far fetched than what the reality ended up being, right? But even just the idea of like a DAO, right? I was like kind of exposed to these very early on, and like the idea of like distributed coordination among people, and then like using money or a token to incentivize your desired outcomes and actions in this like giant on-chain system and game, right? It was like this is what the world is. The world is just a like the game that's like set up around you is just this giant incentive game structured by somebody to hopefully get you to do some whatever their desired outcome is, right? And it's like it makes so much sense to make these things programmatic, written in immutable software and immutable code where the rules are public. Everyone can read the rules. Everybody will know the expected behavior. Everyone knows what happens if X happens or if Y happens, where you don't have that level of transparency in the real world with these games and systems, right? So Ethereum was like early on, like the clear, I was like, oh, this is like the interesting thing. This is like I think like Bitcoin's cool and everything, right? But Bitcoin's slow. I can't really do too much with Bitcoin. I can just like kind of send Bitcoin to somebody, right? I was like really interested early on like anyone that was trying to do stuff with like external like scripting in Bitcoin, which is kind of like how I fell in the counterparty rabbit hole as well. So like, okay, how do you like extend this functionality, right? And then I got super jaded on it with there's a long story of like in the history of like, I don't know, like Luke Jr. went to church one day and like came back and was like, XRP transactions are like spam to the blockchain, and like I'm pushing a core update and like banning or I'm blacklisting like counterparty transactions from the OP script thing. And I was like, oh, okay, like you can do a lot more stuff with this, and I don't think Bitcoin's going to let us do that. And that's like what in the early days, a lot of that stuff really sold me to spend a lot of effort into understanding and working with Ethereum, right? Which and it's kind of the core complaint you have today of like the Bitcoin guys, right? And as I've developed, I've probably come more to the understanding of, while I don't think you should be like blacklisting XRP transactions, like as a core dev, I understand and I value like the making Bitcoin hard type like thesis, which is like, don't like touch it, don't change it, it works, right? And like there's some give and take with that, but some time ago, I was like, you guys are like boomers. You're never going to keep up. You're never going to adapt. Like you need to like do all this new stuff. Like we have all these cool new crypto things. Like, it's people like, oh, they're going to like build a privacy layer into Bitcoin. Right. And it's like, no, like they're not. And like, it's like, no. And like, I kind of get it. Right. Like Bitcoin works as it is. Right. And like, it's like one of the most powerful and like best things we have in the world. Why are you going to like try to jeopardize this by, introducing new functionality, new features, new this, new that. So I think that's just Bitcoin is like fossilized to some extent. Right. And that's probably a good thing. And then Ethereum was kind of the new playground, right? And this is what it feels a lot like Interop is today. It's kind of the new playground, right? And it feels like it's everybody more or less fighting and not fighting in a bad way, but fighting and competing for what is the best way to approach a lot of these things that we know are like defined problems within them, right? So we know what we want to do. It's like, okay, now like today we have 300 Ethereum. Right, more or less 300 little worlds. They all live in isolation, like separated away from each other. And if we can combine all of these to communicate somehow, some way, right, you unlock arguably like a super Ethereum now, right? And I say Ethereum broadly, right? With Solana, whatever, a smart contracting like protocol and platform where economic activity is taking place on, right? If you can figure out a way for all these things to communicate and interact with each other now, you have the best of everything, right? And I think it's important that we architect and build this stuff in a way that as closely as possible resembles the architecture and engineering path that like a lot of core Ethereum took, which is ensuring that these things are built, you know, robustly, properly decentralized in a way that can withstand, you know, a long time horizon, right? That won't be dead 2 or 3 years from now because of, you know, there's like an old saying people used to say, and I still think about it all the time, and it's just that like, what is it? It's just in a broad stroke, power corrupts, right? If anybody has power within a system on a long enough time horizon, it corrupts, right? So it's like solving a lot of these problems that like I think core Ethereum solved. But in today's modern context, with the fact that we now have 300 chains, we have assets across all these different chains, right? We have people issuing wrapped assets. We got liquidity pools over here. We got this, we got that, right? So it's like, how do you approach this from a protocol manner and way where 10 years from now, it's still working well, and there is no one anybody or entity within that system that has the ability to be corrupt, right? Because in the long run, I don't think that works. And a lot of people like to make that trade-off today, and a lot of things that's like probably okay to make that trade-off in, right? For whatever application that you're doing. But if you really want to build this kind of meta omni layer of connecting all these things together, right? You arguably need to build it to the same level that Bitcoin and Ethereum were built, right? Which is, you know, to the furthest end of the spectrum of decentralization, in the way where, you know, there can't be an entity there that has the ability to have stronger say in things than other participants in the system. You know, this technology will inevitably piss off well-capitalized actors, and like, just like as an example, right? And it's just if it's not built to that way, right? Like, it's going to die. It just will. And we have countless examples of that from blockchains and applications and etc. So yeah, in a lot of ways, it feels like a lot of people are, this Interop stuff feels like a lot of the early Ethereum experimentation and a lot of the trials and failures and tests and early concepts of, does this work? Does that not work? Why did that work? Why did that not work? Stuff like that. So it's one of the most exciting like directions of things that I've seen, I think, in the last couple of years by a long margin. Of, you know, it's something that touches a lot of users. So it's like very used in like, it's, if you can build something useful with this, people will actually use it today. But it also holds the weight of solving like a real problem in crypto, I think.
But I feel, before we get into gas, I feel like so how you describe an interop protocol should be built is very trust minimized, decentralized in every way possible, right? But I feel like just because the way chains are built structurally, it's almost impossible to connect them in a way that's trust minimized, right? Like, you have to kind of trust a protocol in between. And I'm not sure if the vision that you just described for interop protocols is actually possible. Does that actually scare you?
It's a hard problem to solve, right? You know, absolutely. And like, by all means, I'm describing what I think is like the ultimate end game of it, right? And like what should be the like ultimate successful desired end game of it. But yeah, it's very, and like for the most part, none of these L2s are decentralized, right? Like properly decentralized, nowhere near the like description that I just gave, right? You know, I have some faith in that. I think there's a handful of teams out there working on L2 stuff that believe in the correct things and are actually trying to build an architect to that end goal for their chain, which a lot of people will disagree with, right? Just the whole like sequencers will never decentralize like type argument, right? And like, I understand the incentives, right? But I still think there's a handful of people out there building this stuff that understand the correct reasons to do things and are ultimately in good faith building in that direction. But yeah, like it's and even if you built this like perfectly decentralized Interop meta layer, right? Like, does it matter if all the L2s are centralized? Like, does it even matter, right? Like, maybe not, right? So then like, okay, maybe some centralized validators and relayers are like great for this, right? Who cares? So there's still a lot of moving prongs in it to where like, does this matter? And like, does this not matter in short term, right? But yeah, like, I mean, a huge factor in this is the development path of, I think, L2s and like all chains, right? And in what ways do those develop? How quickly do those develop? What do their end state actually practically look like in reality in the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Maybe it's good, maybe it's not, right? I don't have a super informed or strong opinion other than it's definitely sus today. And I think a lot of teams are happy being sus with their L2s, but I think there's a handful of them out there that are building in good faith in the correct direction. And it's more of a question of can they do it or not, right? Not a question of will they do it. Like, I think there's people that will definitely try. And if they can do it successfully, then I think that becomes the standard adopted version of all of this, right? But it's still a massive unknown, right? Yeah. And in the short term, yeah, the stuff that we have today like works, right? Like, it works well. Like, I can get around chains super quick, super fast, super cheap. Like, nobody's scamming me, right? There's no Interop protocol that's like ripping me off and I can't dispute it or whatever. Like, for the most part, it works today, right? The question is it robust and reliable over a decade, multi-decade time frame, right? And that's more of the unknown, I think.
Makes sense. I feel like the trade-offs are fine in the short term, but long term we have to figure out like better solutions, right?
Yeah.
So now I want to get into what you're building right now with gas. So just tell us like what it is. How did you guys think of that idea, and why did you decide to build it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think I mentioned briefly before, but Gas was initially like almost like a weekend hackathon project, like out of our team, right? And it was born out of more or less. I was actually doing a lot of chain exploring with a lot of these new L2s. This was maybe a year and a half ago, right? A lot of these new L2s coming out and such. And the core thing that I was like interested in that like made us build it at first, the first iteration had like 5 chains. And I was like, I want like a multi-sender bridge. Like, I use like dispense.app or disperse.app, that thing that, you know, sends a bunch of tokens all at once, right? And I was like, why does this not exist? But like, I want to go to like both Arbitrum and Optimism at the same time, right? And in hindsight, that's like kind of what Gas, one of its like, you know, like unique features today. And fun fact, roughly 1 in 5 people who transact on Gas send to more than one destination chain at the same time, which like isn't huge, right? And it's not like a home run type like feature or metric, right? But it's like interesting enough that got me thinking like, oh, like there's probably like some underdesigned like or underexplored design space in the bridging realm, right? Because like functionality and feature wise, it's all kind of very similar across the board. But yeah, I essentially wanted like a multi-sender across chains. So we kind of built this together one day, and then we put it live. I put it out on Twitter, and some people started using it. We added a couple more chains, and then, you know, 2 or 3 months into it, we were kind of like, oh, there's some users here, and we were getting really good feedback. Actually, we were getting a lot of people coming to us being like, "Yo, this thing's sick, right?" And like, it worked, and this is exactly what I wanted. And it takes a lot of the bloat out of a lot of the bridges that existed back then. So it was like a really good feedback loop for us. And shortly after that, we were like, "Hey, actually, you know, one of the hardest things in building a product in crypto is just attracting and acquiring users. You can build the sickest thing in the world, right? But if you have no users, you're just going to die, right? You're dead." So it was like the kind of wake up for us was like, oh, well, we have users here. We don't exactly know where this can go right now, but I know I have a product, and I know I have at the time a couple hundred people coming here every day and using it, right? And that's a lot. I'm 2 steps ahead of like the vast majority of other crypto like product ideas that, you know, we were considering building at the time, right? So yeah, and then, you know, kind of fast forward to today, right? You know, Gas, I just pushed it to 200, and we just got it to 255 chains or something. So it's 250 chains, right? It's I think I've called it before, you know, a baby bridge, right? Because it's a low liquidity bridge, and that's what allows us to, you know, have this kind of chain coverage that nobody else can really have. You know, your previous podcast on the solvers, right? Like went into this a lot in terms of what makes sense for a solver to actually go and provide liquidity to and take these routes, right? So not a lot of any other bridges really are willing to take a lot of the long tail stuff, because in reality, if you're going to like support it like a real bridge, you just like need a lot of liquidity. And even if like, it's not even like a lot of liquidity, but like you need a couple ETH over there at least, right? To support like standard kind of bridging. And like with 250 chains, like, okay, suddenly that's like a lot of money. Suddenly it's a lot of dormant capital, right? And don't get me wrong, you go to Gas and you see the amount of chains we support, you know, the bottom 50% of chains, right? Almost no usage, like on the average day. But the idea is that we will support it. We will have that route capitalized with a very small amount of capital for in the event you do need to bridge to X exotic chain because something has occurred over there. We're one of the few people that have a working capitalized route, and you remember, you come, you use it, and hopefully then I capture you as a user for some of your other bridging flow that you do in, you know, a regular chain or, you know, a more popularized type chain. So yeah, it's, you know, we didn't necessarily go into this startup looking to build a bridge by any means, right? And putting it out into the world was a kind of a testing the water of, when we first built it, everyone told me, I talked to, like, you know, advisors, investors, friends, right? And they're all like, Tom, you're an idiot. Like, bridging is like one of the most competitive products and lanes like in the ecosystem right now. Like, the idea that you're going to go like build a bridge is like people saying they're going to go build Binance like 3 years ago when everybody was like trying to pop up like perpetual exchanges, right? They're just like, it's like super competitive. It's super hard. You're never going to get users. You're never going to get traction. Like, it's like, this is like a lost cause, bro. So it was a lot of testing the ground of, okay, can we build something that offers at least a unique enough experience and like product delivery that I can attract users at least, right? And if I can get the users, then I can build other stuff. I can build whatever, right? In the long run, and convert those users over to the other things that we build, right? So it worked out in hindsight a lot better than I had anticipated in the beginning, and that anyone around me in the beginning anticipated too. They were just like, I get it, it's cool, it's like a multi-sender type thing, but they're like, as like a realm of like competing in the bridging lane, they're like, you're cooked, bro. Like, it's just, bridges are super competitive. You're never going to win with this. You're never going to be able to build something that competes with the, you know, I mean, at the time they were like, you're never going to, like, they're like, everyone's happy with the canonical. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, everyone's just going to use the canonical bridge. Like, what do you mean? It's like cheap and it's like fast. You know, like, but 15 minutes, right? They're like, it's fast. What do you mean 15 minutes? Like, why do you need to be faster, right? Fast forward to today, right? And now we have, you know, we have Hart saying that one of the most important factors of bridging is getting it there in under 2 seconds, right? You know, and but you know, it's changed like very, very significantly, even in the last like 6 months, give or take, right? But yeah, fundamentally, I try to deliver a better product experience than your traditional bridger. And I use all these things myself too, right? So I try to solve problems that like I actually had going out into the world, such as, you know, multi-sending, even a lot of these routes, a new chain will pop up and a lot of bridges will support it. But XLayer is a great example, which is like the OKX new chain. Every bridge that supported it supports just ETH bridging. And the gas token is OKB. And like, I had like dozens of people come into our Discord, right? And they're like, hey, I used like so-and-so bridge, and like now I have ETH and it's stuck. How do I get gas over there, right? There's no faucet. It's like real money. It's mainnet money, right? So there's no faucet. And it's just like, as a bridge, like, why would you build this? Like, you're letting users like send money over that just gets stuck. It's a cliff, right? We call them cliffs, the ones where you bridge over there and you get stuck. So, you know, like, these are just like, okay, so like, we're going to support the native assets, right? The asset you need. And that's why it's called gas, right? You know, you can use it for other things, the asset, once you get there, right? But functionally, it's always going to be your gas token. You're never going to have to worry about, I get there and I don't have the native asset, right? And then even just supporting a lot of chains. That's kind of the, you know, end of it is just, I have a roster of 6 bridges, right? I use to like get to all these places and deal with all this stuff and get to my chains that I want to get to. And, you know, well, I would like a real big bridge with this sort of chain coverage, right? This is the best thing we can get right now in terms of, you know, liquidity coverage, even just infrastructure, right? A lot of these long tail L2s, like, I wouldn't even trust putting real money on, to be honest with you. You know, you want to put $500 on there? Sure. You know, but like, you want to put 10 grand on there? I don't know, man. I've had 6 or 7 chains just shut off on us. Money's gone. They just stop paying. They stop paying Conduit. They stop paying Caldera. RPCs go down. There's no Genesis like file released. You can't run your own node. Just like, sorry, bro. Like, money's gone. Like, team's out. They post like a message in their Telegram. They're like, thanks for everybody. I'm just like, wait, but like, there's like $80,000 in your canonical bridge. What are we gonna do about that? Like, it's just cooked.
So this is like a rug pull on a chain level.
Oh yeah, and like, I think you're gonna see it happen much more in the next 6 months, right? 8 months, as people begin to realize it's hard to compete as a business where your business is just like, I'm an alt chain or I'm an L2 if you don't have some real driving activity over there. Because like, it seems cheap at first. You're like, oh yeah, I can go to Caldera. I can pay $3,000 a month. I have my own blockchain. I'm the king of the blockchain, right? I run the sequencer. I set all the rules. I'm the king, right? Sounds like a sick deal until you're like 12 months into it, and you're like, oh well, I've paid like $40,000. I have these like anchoring costs. I have these like data costs. I have all this stuff. I have two or three guys on payroll, like managing it, and like suddenly you're like, oh, actually, this is like a non-trivial cost, and this chain isn't making any money. So like, what are we going to do about it? And you get into a really weird world with that, right? And PGN is kind of in this state right now, Public Goods Network, where they tried to shut the chain down and they realized they couldn't. They had like $1.5 million ETH bridged over there, right? And there was no permissionless exit, for the stack. I think it's an OP chain, right? So there was no way to get them to force money off, and so they've kept it running. And like I think the most recent proposed solution was to force some like a regular state thing and essentially jack everyone's money and put it into a claim contract on Ethereum, right? Which like, sure, it would solve the problem, right? But like, that's like definitely not what we're supposed to be doing with it, right? So I think that's going to happen a lot more there's just so many chains, man. And a lot of them, they're good intended and there's good teams behind them and they're really trying, right? And like, there's just little to no activity. And then there's some that like a team isn't even trying and there's little to no activity. So there's a lot of things I think are just going to wind down in the next year or so. And you're going to have a weird world where there's a lot of money locked over there and you don't really know what to do with it yet.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to get much easier to deploy a chain, but then at some point people are going to realize it's actually not that easy to maintain it. So they're just going to like abandon the project. But just going back a little into like your story with gas. So it seems like you started off fairly simple, right? Like you were like, I'm a bridge user. What's one of my core needs right now? If I go to a chain, I need the gas token. And it seems like some of the bridges are kind of, they have a blind spot here in terms of they're supporting a new chain, but they don't support the native asset on that chain. So it feels like you went with one of the core needs of a bridging user. And then the main plan was, okay, let me attract the user first. Once they're on my front end, I can probably convert them later on into like doing more different types of transactions.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And our first kind of at least iteration or example of that, right, was we have a layer 0 gas reloader as well too, right, which is a separate product from like the traditional gas product, but functionally does the same thing, delivers gas to you on your destination chain, right? But layer 0 was super popular. It was like even just a year ago or 8 months ago, right? There's a bunch of Interop solutions today. A bunch of them existed back then too, right? But they were nowhere near as prominent as they are today. In comparison to where layer 0 was, right? Like layer 0 has like public narrative competition today, at least in terms of Interop, whereas 8 months ago, it was much lesser. It was like, if you looked in the direction of Interop, it was like kind of like layer 0 and like kind of Wormhole. But like even Wormhole had like really slim chain selection at that time. It was really, there wasn't a lot of like good docs on how to build with it or like even how this thing really worked. It was still kind of a bit of a black box. And layer 0 was like very, at least open and transparent with like, this is what it is. We have good dev docs. You can come and build on this today, right? And other things existed too, but they were just in a much different state, 8 months ago than they were. So we looked in that direction, and we initially looked in layer 0 direction to like replace the backend that powers like the traditional gas product, and quickly came to the determination that if we wanted to continue to support these like really exotic long tail chains, we wouldn't like it's just not possible with particularly where layer 0 was 8 months ago, right? I think they supported 35 or 40 chains when we first started doing it. But they had this kind of native gas drop function in the protocol, which made it also an extremely easy fit to do it, right? It was like a very like logical. There was no like ethos or ideological reason for picking layer 0 back then, other than like, okay, there's like 2 or 3 solutions that exist. And like, guess what? This one offers us like a sick native like gas drop, like built into the relayer, which is exactly what we want, right? And yeah, the idea was, okay, put out something similar, right? People were farming layer 0. People wanted to do layer 0 activity. If I put up a parallel product here, can I convert a bunch of users over to that, right? And it was super successful at the time, right? Combination of converting our user base over and just the attraction and narrative that layer 0 had at the time, particularly like leading up to the airdrop and the TGE, right? But yeah, that was kind of our core thesis was, if I can get people coming and I can get people that like the product, right? And then they trust us, they trust the brand, they know that we'll build something that is reliable, they've used it before, the transaction's always clear, they never have a problem. I can build more things in the future, and hopefully all those users will come be users of my new thing as well, right? So gas was very much like a MVP user acquisition type thing, where like experimenting, does this work, and can I get people to use it? And I think probably 3 or 4 months ago, we like made the real decision of like, okay, this worked to some extent. We have a bunch of users, we have people using it, people really like it. what is the next iteration, and what do we build next, and how do we further deliver. I just want to like deliver a product that's like actually useful to people, right? And like if you can do that, it's just people come, and like I don't believe this in like all the cases, right? Whole if you build it, they will come. Like that's not true, right? But I think like if you build something that just actually solves a handful of like real problems, and this is like it's like so cliche to say, right? It's like obviously everyone knows this, like build the thing that like solves real problems, right? But we're still building shit every day that like doesn't solve real problems, right? It's like, okay, well, like, okay, go bridge to 100 chains, write down your like top 10 complaints about like your process and doing all of those, and build something that addresses all of those. And then if you can get that into a product and ship that out in front of people, chances are everyone else also ran into those sets of complaints and problems, and et cetera. And you've now offered a better product. People actually come and want to use that thing, right? I think actually, someone off the top, Jumper is a very good example of that, right? Like a very good example of that in terms of like just build something that solves someone's problem, right? And like it worked amazingly well with, like sure, Jumper has a lot more like technical and like hard differences and problems to solve, and the fact that it's cross-chain now, right? But like the aggregator playbook was public, right? Like 1inch killed it with this. I remember when 1inch went public, and it was like it like changed the game in swapping. Everyone was like, oh shit, like I'm using 1inch. Like why would I not use 1inch? It aggregates me the best price across everywhere, and I don't need to like do it manually. Like it was a real problem, right? And then like we invented that same problem again across chain, right? And I'm actually like surprised that there aren't tons of aggregators because or bridge aggregators, because after 1inch's success, there were tons of token aggregators that popped up, right? A lot died, a couple survived. But like just very good example of that, right? Like core problem, someone doesn't know how to get to the Say blockchain. Don't need to know. Go to Jumper and it gives me the route, right? Like, and you get users that way. It works, right?
I feel like your approach is so simple but so effective in every way possible. Like from actually building this product to adding features to it to actually even the LZ decision, right? It's pragmatic in every way, right? Like we want to support a feature which Interop protocol can actually help us build it. Okay, we can use LZ, right? And then once you shift it to layer zero, I feel like uh, your usage increased in many ways because I had used gas for sure, but I started seeing gas more and more on my timeline after the LZ integration and after like the airdrop hype kind of got in more users. So do you feel this ecosystem alignment in a way makes sense for interop projects and bridges? And should people actually consider this when they're choosing an interop provider?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like being a layer zero product has been extremely helpful for us as a small startup and a small product, right? Like, and that's like, it's like no secret. As you said, you can see it on the timeline, right? And like the team there has been like fantastic to us, right? They've been more than helpful for anything we need. Super encouraging to continue to build things. They want to do spaces with us. They want to, because understandably so, they built a protocol for developers to come build applications on. When people build applications that people actually use, they want to push that to their community and their world too, and say like, look, here's an example of something you could do with this, right? So like, it's like, it makes sense and that alignment's there, right? And yeah, like if you're going to build some but on the flip side of the coin too, it's I think it's important to still stay like level-headed to some extent in terms of the solution that you end up using and building, right? And like I love layer zero, I love the people there, they're great. Like the product itself solved all the problems that I needed when I was like building the layer zero gas reloader, right? But at the same time, right, like there's a reason like the gas, like traditional gas, isn't built on layer zero right now, right? And like because like there's still trade-offs that you make with this stuff, right? And there's still other interop protocols that exist in the world, right? All with different trade-offs as well too, right? So I still think it's important to like stay level-headed and also up to date and like modern with what everybody is building, right? Because I have heavier criticisms of other interop protocols, right? But I still have criticisms of layer zero as well too, right? Like I tell it like bluntly, and I'm not shy about it, right? And they know it too, right? Like it is what it is. But they've been super helpful in just helping getting our product into the hands of the people that were in the layer zero ecosystem and not in ours prior to that, right? And somewhat understandably and rightfully so. But at the same time, it's I think if you're building a product for an end user, you should always be building with what tool you think best solves your problem, right? And that can be something today and something else tomorrow, right? Not that I'm saying that I think there's any other Interop thing that I should have built this on by any means. Layer 0 was definitely the best, solution for us here. And I think it's, in a broad stroke, my Interop protocol of choice, right? But at the end of the day, you should use the tools that allow you to build what you want to build, regardless of whatever alignment you may have with, an adjacent team or protocol or project, right? And if the thing that you built on is the best solution, like, good shit, you've won, right? That's good. But yeah, I think, there's a lot of camps in the Interop stuff, right? There's a lot of, you're a layer 0 person, you're a wormhole person, you're an Axelar person, I guess. You're a hyperlane person, or you're like a proprietary messaging protocol person, right? Which is like your thing rolled its own messaging. And you die in the hill of one of these things, right? And currently, I think particularly publicly, right? Like, I come across something as like I'm dying in the layer 0 hill, right? And right now it's true, because that's the thing that I've built on. It's the thing that best solves my problem, right? And it's the thing that I think best has addressed this issue to date, right? But I think it's super important that if you're trying to build particularly user-facing products, none of these people are building user-facing products, right? For the most part, they're building developer-facing protocols. So if you're the one that's trying to then transcribe that into a user-facing product, you should always use whatever best tools available to you, right? Because that's what's ultimately going to make the best solution for end users right now. So yeah, in a grand scheme, I think if you're building one of these things in the short term, it's definitely great to, build something that the protocol you're building on feels you have correctly and professionally and well articulated their solution to the world, right? And if you can do that, you align yourself very, very well with them. And these people have, a whole ecosystem of themselves of users that are looking for projects to use built on top of it, right? So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense if you're a startup or you're a product to, if you're building on one of these things, talk to the team and become friends with them, right? They're super helpful. They want to be your friend. They want to help you. They want to see you succeed, right? Because if you succeed, they succeed, and vice versa. So yeah, from our end, Layer 0 has been great to us. The protocol's been great to us. It is what it is. The protocol's public. It's transparent. It's immutable. It's whatever, right? It solves the problems I need. It does nothing that nobody knows it doesn't do. It's it's the best solution for what we needed at that point in time, right? And that's away from the arguments of does a cross beat Stargate and yada yada, right? Just from I'm a lowly dev trying to build a retail product here. What product or what Interop solution gives me the best toolkit to build the thing I want to build?
But do any of these Twitter discussions actually get to you? Because let's say you're in a layer 0 camp, or you're in some projects camp, and some people are shitting on it on Twitter and saying all sort of stuff. Does that make you reconsider stuff, or do you just ignore it?
No, I don't ignore it by any means. I definitely read and take into consideration other people's criticisms and stuff, right? Because while things can be biased, people obviously have biases when they put these things out, right? Usually baked within it, there's some bit of truth, right? And it's kind of a process of sifting through the bias and figuring out what is truthful in here, and then baking that now into your model mentally of how does this thing work and how do I interact with it, right? So and I'm long past the point of criticism bothering me, right? Particularly about us, about things I build on, anything like that, right? It's you really got to do something to trigger me hard nowadays. It's I'm well past that point. So usually the critics have a bit of validity in the criticism, right? And that's very justifiable. I think it's just a matter of digesting what they're saying and trying to figure out, again, so much of this stuff is subjective, right? So it's also how do you size up what they think is a criticism, right? The definition of decentralization varies whoever you speak to, right? So it's well, what do you think is decentralized versus how someone else views it, right? And someone can say this is a centralized, dumpster fire. And it's well, you're viewing it under this lens, and I view it under this lens, right? And we have different considerations, or I just don't agree with your definition of decentralization, right? So it's still a very subjective argument, right? In terms of a lot of criticisms that come across this type of stuff, right? So I think it's important to always have as much information available and digest it and make your own sense of it, right? There's I would like to think there is a canonical truth to a lot of these definitions and like opinions and whatnot, but like there isn't, right? You talk to all these people, there just absolutely isn't. Everyone has a different definition of decentralization. Everyone has a different definition of interoperability, just like everything, right? Permissionless means one thing to one person, something entirely something else to somebody else. And if you take them in under all these different lenses, you can write a million criticisms about everybody, right? Like, so I think it's just digest as much information as you can, try to establish how you view and believe these things, and then build it into your own model. And, ultimately the good products will win, right? And like, I do believe that strongly in the long run. So that's why I'm not concerned for anybody, right? Because it's in the long run, whoever builds the best solution to these problems that we have at hand is going to be the thing that is most widely used, adopted, and successful like 5 years from now, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like especially for builders who are building on top of these protocols, this sort of conviction is very important, right? Like, because how many times can you actually integrate a product and then just be like, okay, I'm gonna move on to another one, and then you're gonna see another tweet about it, and you'll be like, okay, let's move on to the third one, right? Like that's just not how it works. Every protocol has its own trade-offs, and I would say you should kind of assess all of these trade-offs before you make the decision, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
in your example, you talked about how the users increased because of the layer zero airdrop. So I feel like some people would take that as an example to just get distribution from the airdrop hype, which is
Sure.
not wrong. But then what after the airdrop? Like what happens once the airdrop is done, and then you start seeing all of these like concerns pop up all over your timeline? Your conviction will be rattled, right? So you need to have your reasons sorted out.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. After the highest of the high time of your protocol and product, ultimately comes like below where it once was, right? Yeah, these things then, come out into the narratives, come out into the woodwork. And if you didn't build on the thing for the right reason, like you're going to have the second thoughts about this thing that you've just deployed like months of effort and energy and resources into, right? And that's like it's like you really have to have your conviction in what you're doing prior to doing it, because like there's nothing worse than putting time and energy and money and other people's time and your team into something only months later to be like, this was the wrong decision for whatever reason, right? And like that can happen, and like it's not the end of the world, it's not necessarily, but like building a successful startup is already, the odds are so already astronomically against you, right? The idea that you would spend time that you have to then backtrack on is just like it's a real kick in the stomach, right? So yeah, I think it's really important to have conviction in what you're building prior to building it, right? And that's what we obviously knew going into the layer zero airdrop that people were utilizing layer zero to get layer zero activity, right? Like it was clear by the numbers. Everybody saw, right? Everyone knew. So it's like, obviously this is a user conversion funnel for us, but we also think it's some level of a conversion funnel to test, will our users, Gas traditional users, convert to a new product and try out a new product? What does that conversion look like? So if I shove something else again in the future, what does that hop look like? But then also it was like, we're building functionally a product that is very much in alignment with interoperability and fuel building interoperability solutions. So it makes a lot of sense for us to go into the world. And I mean, we spent probably 2 months, even with like the idea of knowing that like, okay, if you build something on layer zero, you probably get a bunch of users you wouldn't otherwise have, right? We still probably spent a month and a half, 2 months really digging into the Interop solution that existed, and more or less actually just understanding the interoperability protocol or problem in order for us to like feel confident in making that decision, right? I mean, I'm like, okay, this is the thing we're going to now build, because it takes us 2.5 months to build a thing, right? Or 2 months to build a thing. It's a lot of time and resources for a small, like, capital constrained startup to some extent. So, we made sure that we like at least thought we understood the scope of the problem, the scope of the proposed solutions, and ultimately, decide to build on the thing that we think has the longest like longevity for what we think we're building now and what we maybe want to build in the future as well too, which is a bit unknown, but you have to kind of, make some educated guesses there on like what you think you're going to want to do. So yeah, it was really making sure that you know what you're getting yourself into, right? And not putting something out there for the wrong reason, right? And I think it can, a lot of people that did layer zero stuff prior to the airdrop can be seen as like, oh, you did this because you were going to get a bunch of users, because of something unrelated to you, right? And like, sure, everyone knows this. And it was like, yeah, like obviously this was definitely a benefit of building something in this direction as well too, right? But guess what? Like that wasn't the only decision by any means in this decision factor or decision tree, right? And like if I'm going to continue to build Interop or a product that like interfaces with Interop today, right now, still, even with all the solutions on the market, I know everything about all, right? It's like if I was going to build a bridge or any sort of Interop thing, like I would still use layer 0 today, like for my handful of reasons, right? So it's like I was able to at least understand the problem and build that conviction, at least in that solution for right now, right? And it's like that's why we ultimately did that thing, because I still want to build stuff in this realm, and it's not just going to be a gas reloader, right? So it's what exists out there, and even just getting your engineering team into it, right, and understanding the protocols, a huge up ramp time, right? So it's like whatever you get into, you better hope that's a thing that actually continues to solve your problem in the future, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a lot of teams personally that are going through all of these questions, and a lot of the research that I've put out is basically to help these teams understand a lot of these nuances, right? Like what goes around behind the protocols. Because I feel like if a bridge actually gets hacked, it's the teams building on top that face the worst outcomes, because they lose business or they go out of business because of some third party, right? So it's the worst case outcome for them. But like talking about your experience building and using all of these bridges, what would be your three key takeaways? One as a user and two as a builder.
Yeah. Well, so at least today, a key takeaway, which is something I didn't necessarily anticipate 6 months ago, even give or take, is that I almost view bridges in two different lanes today now. I essentially view a bridge as a bridge that's on an interop protocol and a bridge that is not even like intent solver based. Like I don't even like a bridge that is like instant liquidity, like instant liquidity one solver bridge, right? And like you're seeing like the relays, the orbiters, these types of things in the world, right? Because there's a different user experience to the tune of your money delivering to the quickness of you being able to switch your network in MetaMask and open up a new block explorer versus 2 minutes, right? Which in the grand scheme of things might not be an ultimate differentiating thing, right? But I didn't necessarily anticipate the rapid growth of these like instant liquidity bridges that exist, right? And they're capped in size, right? And like the fact that the vast majority of bridges today, some like astronomical 90-something%, right? A bridge is like under $10,000, right? The average bridging amount. So like if you can just build an instant liquidity bridge that supports 5 ETH at a time, right? Like you've captured like 97% of the market or something, right? So I really didn't anticipate that, as a takeaway, right?
How does that like sit in your head because of like your cypherpunk
yeah,
ethos?
yeah, it's a clashing and conflicting thing for sure, right? And like the way I view it and the way I see it is honestly very similar to just it's almost a required stepping stone in the timeline of this lane maturing. And you saw this in everything, right? You saw this in Bitcoin, you saw this in Ethereum, you saw this in everything. The first initial solutions of things that like got really good adoption were kind of these like halfway solutions, right? They kind of like halfway solved the problem. They didn't really solve the problem because like it's a hard problem to solve, right? But they kind of like halfway solved it. But the halfway solved solution ultimately provided like a sick user experience that then onboarded and adopted or got a bunch of adoption from these users and like put the idea of the core primitive in everyone's head and got them familiar with it, right? So like while like Orbiter is this instant liquidity bridge or Relay is an instant liquidity bridge, right? Like people are bridging with it. And like people are like getting used to the experience of bridging and the idea of sending money from one chain to another, right? And like they're doing that like onboard and adoption legwork is actually a really hard piece of the puzzle, right? So like it's not a great solution in the long run, probably, right? It's a great solution for the users right now because it's a really good product offering, right? And I imagine it's probably pretty frustrating from the POV of somebody building an interop protocol because you're like, I'm trying to do it the right way, right? And like I'm being arguably, like these guys come in and build something that doesn't conform to any of the sort of problem set that we defined as like the problem set we need to solve in order to interop, right? And like they're eating all the users and they're eating all the liquidity in the flow, right? But that then puts competition and pressure on the interop people to build the better solution, build the better product, right? And that's like ultimately what I believe will happen, right? So eventually I think these two just like converge, right? And like in the meantime, we have these instant liquidity one solver bridges with no dispute mechanisms, no validation, etc. And you have, interop solutions with networks of validators or pick your own validator or whatever. And they both have different trade-offs right now. And ultimately over time, I think the interop solutions will start going down the curve and starting to begin to offer the same level of speed, settlement, chain expansion, speed to chain expansion, right? Instant liquidity bridges can just like add a new bridge immediately. It takes like, no time at all, right? Interop, they have to go and like deploy contracts. They have to understand the chain security profile. They're going to keep real money over there or allow people to bridge real money over there. So I think it's just a required stepping stone in the nature of this stuff maturing, right?
But like long-term net good, that's the summary.
Yeah, I think long-term, I think it's net good in terms of like adoption and continuing to push, continuing to like allow people to be familiar with the idea of different chains, different experiences, getting different places, right? And like, yeah, like a lot of these L2s, like you can't really you can argue like, well, like what's the experience of somebody bridging to an L2 with like little to no activity / there's like one DEX that like offers the same thing you can do on Ethereum, right? Like, okay, but then you have things like Hyperliquid on Arbitrum, right? And like Hyperliquid's like this, like an actual good perp DEX, right? And like perp DEX is like one thing that like probably makes sense to like roll on a chain and like actually do if you can do it right, right? And it's like, well, people need a bridge to Arbitrum, right? And like, okay, well, you're like getting people to Arbitrum to experience this new thing in a faster or more convenient like type way where they don't need to understand a lot of the other stuff that exists over there, right? So I think it's like good from that POV, right? If we don't continue to better the interop solutions and make them larger in expansion, faster, cheaper, etc., and begin to compete with these types of other solutions over there, then it's probably bad. But I don't think that's going to be the case, and I don't think that's going to happen, right? And ultimately, it's an entirely different risk profile, right? There's just a world where something terrible happens because there's one address solver that is fulfilling all these orders, and right, like it takes like one bad event for everyone to be like, oh, actually, this was like a really bad architectural design, and we should like stop doing this, right? So it works until it doesn't to some extent as well too, right? But yeah, from like a user POV, I think it's like generally a good thing. And I think it'll generally push the interop providers to work as hard as they can to offer as close as a competing service, right? And then functionally, that's better for all of us. Better for builders, better for users, better for everybody.
What's the second one as a builder and as a user? Like I feel like you touched on something that's very like popular right now as a topic. So what's the second takeaway?
Well, as a user, actually one of my biggest takeaways as a user is just actually how problematic a lot of these bridges are from like a user POV, which is like you wouldn't necessarily think is like really a real problem, but like it's definitely a real problem. To the extent that like regular users are being thrown down flows without them knowing, where they end up with either the non-native asset, a wrapped asset of something on some destination chain, but they just can't do anything with it. And like, it's just like, why would you let me bridge like Axelar USDC to Kava chain when like there is no, I don't know if that's actually an example. I think there is an Axelar USDC pool on Kava chain, but like, why would you let me bridge this wrapped asset to this chain where there's just like, there isn't even a liquidity pool for it? Like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, why does this route even exist, right? And like, this happens so often. I go and try these things. And I'm like, oh, wow, this route is live? No way. Like, I'm going to try it. And I try it. And it's just like, but it didn't like, oh, okay, you gave me some like wrapped like garbage over here. And like, I was like, you made it look like that wasn't a thing. And like, now it's a thing. And I'm just like, oh, I got to figure out, oh, it's 7-day exit period or something. And you're just like, oh my God, what did I get myself into, right? So like we're still navigating people in like bad directions in some places, right? And I think that's very bad because bridging is already kind of like a black box to a lot of people. We're getting like further away from that, then people are getting more comfortable with it. But like bridging for the most part is a black box, particularly like even the canonical like a year ago, right? You just like send money in the canonical, you're like, I don't know, I kind of like cross my fingers and close my eyes and like pray 15 minutes later I have money somewhere else, right? I don't know what's happening. I don't understand it, like nothing. So like if you do that and then like the thing that shows up is like the wrong thing, you're just like, well, like what the hell am I doing here, man? Like I give up, right? Like I tried, it didn't work. Like I don't know what you want from me. So like it's just a lot of these bridges haven't actually curated the experience, I think, to solving what the user like ideally wants when they come, right? And this is something that we are working a lot on from like a product and UX POV, is that I think there's just UX improvements that can be made on these products like severely. Like something I say is like even to the extent of, I find it really hard to believe that a product structural design, which is something Hayden Adams put together 8 years ago for swapping 6 assets on a single chain, is the structural product design that should persist and is the best structural product design in foreverness in a world where we have 300 blockchains and thousands of assets on all of them, right? And like, I don't know what the exact answer to that is, right? But it's just like, I find it hard to believe that design is the best thing, right? It was something, it's just, I don't know. I think there's probably something better, right? Particularly in a world where there's like unlimited offerings. And like very few people have like tried to iterate on that type of stuff, right? And you're like slowly seeing some bridges start to do some stuff from that realm, right? But if we're like growing at the rate we're going right now, it's only going to get worse in terms of chaosness when you go to a bridge, selecting chain and asset, and there's a million assets and a million chains and yada yada, right? So just like one of my biggest takeaways, like a user still, is that I think the actual user-facing products still have, I don't want to say they're necessarily bad, right? I think there's still a lot of room for growth, and there's a lot of opportunity for product people to build different versions of this type of stuff in terms of a product, right? There's a lot of room for growth, I think.
Yeah, I feel like there are some basic kinks that can be worked out, and the product, like user experience, can be improved so much, right? Like in my experience, I've just sent so many test transactions just to test it out, right? Like just in case something goes wrong. So I've always sent a few dollars as a test transaction, and once I've gotten used to the flow, I go in with like more money.
Yeah, absolutely. I test everything, right? And even to the extent today that most of the stuff is like, I still don't like if I find a new L2 and I want to bridge there, for the most part, now what I do today, and like this is like kind of a wild move, I'd say there's people and they're just like, you're insane. I don't even use the bridge anymore. I go to the Explorer. If it's like an L2, it's like an ETH L2, I go to the Explorer, I go to like the little tab in the corner that's like deposits, L1 to L2. I find the most recent deposit of where somebody deposited into the chain, right? I find the canonical on ETH, the canonical contract, and I just transfer ETH into it. It just shows up on the other place, right? And it's just like, okay, like I don't need to go use your like Caldera like front end to like do this thing, right? Like I just send the ETH to the canonical contract, right? So I'm like, this is like actually the like easiest way for me to not to, and like this obviously is not the solution for an end user, right? But it's like, oh, I can see someone else deposited ETH into the canonical. I can see it got credited over here. Like I know it's gonna work, right? Unlike I go to a bridge and I'm like, does this bridge even work? I don't know. Do they have an old like deposit contract in there? I don't know, right? Actually, I'm just gonna go get the most recent deposit on chain and just copy what this guy did in the transaction flow, right? And like it probably works out better than me using half these like, you know, broken or stale bridges, right? A lot of them are just stale today. That's like the problem too, a lot of it, right?
Again, like super pragmatic with your approach. You see a problem, you see a solution to it, you just go use it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Oh, okay. I can just. This. Yep. Looks like an L2 mailbox. Like, okay. Yep. Send it in there, right?
Awesome. What's your last one?
Yeah, you know, as what do you want as builder or as a user?
Anything, up to you.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, well, this is like I guess as a builder, and I guess as a broader DeFi participant. And this is something I don't actually have the like well thought out how the end game to it is. So I'm actually curious your thoughts on this as well too. Some of my thoughts, you know, there's like the whole like you know, the protocol and liquidity intense argument going on, yada yada, right? And like outside of the argument of the product entirely, right? I don't want to argue about the product. I don't want to argue about anything like that. The thing I've been more thinking about is it problematic that we are building products like bridges that are incentivizing crypto liquidity, particularly active liquidity, right? This is active capital in the ecosystem, that we are incentivizing these liquidity providers to essentially privatize and off-chain these massive pools of liquidity that may otherwise, or presumably would have otherwise, existed in an on-chain element somewhere, or an on-chain protocol, right? Like one of the big things of DeFi that was cool and that works is that you have programmatic liquidity, right? And like you can borrow $100 million for free as long as you return it in a second, right? And like that liquidity is there. And so if we continue to stray on the path of essentially private market makers, solvers, RFQ, et cetera, for everything, bridges, dexes, this, et cetera, that, what ends up happening in a world where we have a COVID type crash in the market, right? And 1/6 of Aave's TVL needs to be liquidated. Like, does that liquidity exist on chain anymore? I don't know. Like, have we incentivized enough size of liquidity that would otherwise maybe be active on chain liquidity to move off chain? And then in the long run, is that like an existential problem for us, like in DeFi, right? And you can imagine if all the active liquidity went privatized and off chain, now you would probably actually have a problem, right? And like that's not going to happen. It's the most extreme version of it, right? But and even to the extent of we are relatively trusting that these people are benevolent actors today, right? These like PMMs and solvers and etc. And for the most part, they act in like financially rational, like their best interest, right? But like they don't have to. And when like the money's on chain, like you have to act within the rules of the law that is like within this smart contract, right? And when the money's off chain now, like they're not bound to those same law of what the software tells it can and can't do, right? So like what existential problems do you have when we begin to build DeFi that relies on, somewhat opaque off-chain actors, right? And like it works today. And like I'm not like necessarily saying these people, I'm not saying all these people are like malicious or bad or whatnot, right? And I do think in a very broad stroke, they will, for the most part, always act like in their own best interest, and their own best interest is probably just being like a good actor and benevolent. But it's an unexpected turn that I think DeFi took, that I don't know what the long tail, if there are any ramifications of that may be, right? If we take $1 billion of liquidity that would otherwise be in active on-chain DeFi protocols and privatize it and shove it off-chain, what happens when things need liquidation? What happens when mid-tier liquidity pools that may otherwise have some of this stuff, are now half the size, right? How does that affect like the end user swapping? It's just like we've like taken liquidity out of the ecosystem, right? Arguably. We like think it's still there because it kind of is, but it's there for its own selected lane of thing, and it can decide if it wants to participate in that thing or not, right? So I don't know how that ends, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently with the intense versus protocol owned liquidity type argument, right?
I mean, it's again spot on in terms of what's going on in the ecosystem right now, right? And it's not just for bridges, it's also for the swapping ecosystem, right? Yeah. More and more protocols are turning either entirely away from AMMs to private liquidity, or like some kind of hybrid model, right? So I feel like this is again a very spot on trend. So on that topic, I don't know what happens in like a COVID sort of situation. Like you can never tell what happens, right? But I feel like overall this would attract more capital to the ecosystem, because I feel market makers broadly understand this off-chain private inventory concept more easily, right? So they'd be more comfortable giving their liquidity to some of these players rather than putting it on chain. So I feel like overall more liquidity comes into the ecosystem, but because this liquidity that's like off chain, it's given with a very specific goal, right? Like they're looking for a financial opportunity here. They need incentives, they need to make money with it. So I'm actually not sure if they're gonna use it to liquidate people and take a loss on it, right? In that sort of scenario, either the protocols would actually use their own inventory to do it, because it's still in their best interest to actually get the order flow, right? So there is that kind of liquidity as well. But I feel like this private inventory that's third party and they actually have to show a return on it, this will not participate in case of like a COVID crash.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I took a bunch of calls with just like Twitter people the other week, and somebody said something to me, and I was like an actually deeply insightful thing that I realized, and like that I knew, but nobody ever actually like said it to me like that. And like I'm a big proponent of like I was like super active in DeFi summer, right? So it's like, when's DeFi summer coming back, right? When are we gonna get this back? Yeah, right. And this guy said to me, he goes, I don't know if DeFi summer ever comes back in this current trend, and my reasoning why is that the yield of DeFi summer never left. It's just now in the hands of private off-chain market makers. It has been concentrated into the hands of off-chain private market makers. The yield that we all once sought after and harvested as just a humble DeFi farmer, it never left. It's still all right here. They're just PMMs on CowSwap and Across and Uniswap X and wherever, right? These people have just like eaten the yield of the world, right? And it's exactly that, right? Like they want the yield. That's why they're there, right? And yeah, they can get capital deployed into it. They don't have smart contract risk, right? That's like a huge thing for a large sum of capital, right? Like, I mean, you have I have a key on a server somewhere type risk, which is like, I don't know how much better that is per se, right? But it's an entirely different risk profile, right? But yeah, it was like, oh yeah, that's like probably kind of true. Like, I don't think the yield actually disappeared anywhere. It just got concentrated into the hands of like the most sophisticated and well-capitalized actors that are willing to build to some extent. Like they have to be willing to, they're not passive, right? Like the yield left all passive people for the most part. You can't be passive and earn this yield anymore. You have to be active. You have to like build your own implementations of a cow swap solver. You have to do all this stuff, right? But if you can do that, the yield exists and the yield is there for you, right? So it's concentrated into the hands of the highly sophisticated, highly technical, somewhat risk-taking, and like well-capitalized actors, right? Which I think in the broad stroke right now is, I don't know, what, a couple dozen guys. It was like the joke we make. I was like, who are the solvers, right? Like, who are these people? Like, I know like 6 people, right? And it's just, I think those guys are eating. I think they have all the yields right now, man. That's it's always been DeFi summer for those guys. It never left, you know. They just cook all day.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like the yield is still there, but maybe not for the retail anymore. Like we just don't see it. I
Yeah.
actually don't know, right? Like I honestly don't know where the yield is or if the
Yeah,
solvers are actually getting it.
I'm very much speculating here, but I was like, it like kind of makes sense, right? You know, they are some of the few people still in the ecosystem I know that are making money, like doing on-chain activities, right? You know, that just like doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, right? But yeah, you know, just on that, it's just I think this was maybe a unanticipated turn that like DeFi took in terms of DeFi was sick. We were like, we're going to put all this stuff on chain. It's like code is law, like there's programmatic rules. We like know how everything functions. We can do flash loans. We can do all this stuff, right? And then like a year and a half, 2 years ago, we're like a lot of this liquidity just started pivoting into this like off-chain opaque world, right? And it's super beneficial for a lot of reasons that we all know and see, right? Makes great products, gets really good order execution, makes for a better experience in a lot of ways for the end user, right? I don't know how it ends. I'm curious on if there is external long-term, concerns or problematic issues that arise because of this, right? And I think it was relatively unexpected. And it's just a takeaway from digging into a bunch of this stuff that like, it's around you all day, every day, but like, I don't think unless you like really look at it and think of it, you realize that's what's actually occurring here, right? Like, I don't know how many users that use a cross actually understand what's happening behind the scenes there, right? Or like even the difference between protocol and liquidity and intent-based, solving, right? Yeah. So it's just like, how does this actually end out? Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know, right? But it's a question that I wasn't anticipating like running into when I like first went into like the bridging and interop like rabbit hole, right?
I feel like time will tell. Right now, we can enjoy the better user experience, and
Absolutely.
I
Well,
honestly like, yeah, honestly, there's nothing wrong with it. We just don't know how it will end up, right? So
Absolutely.
it's just let's see how it plays out eventually. So this was honestly great because like I got to learn a lot from a very OG crypto user to how to look at the bridging ecosystem today, right? So I feel like that there are a bunch of insights in this conversation. Just to wrap it up with like one final question, what would you like to achieve with gas in the interop space?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so most importantly, and the thing that I think that we can excel at as a team to some extent is building a good user-facing product. I'm not here to like compete like on like the tech of Interop of the world, right? Like that's not my wheelhouse. That's not our wheelhouse. That's not what we're best at, right? And there's a bunch of teams working really hard on that, and have huge further advances that we'll ever have. Like it's like I'm not here to like compete on like the interop technology and the I'd like to think that us building on it may be able to provide feedback and support people building the stuff to hopefully push them in the right direction of building the correct thing and support them building the correct thing, right? But that's not what we want to build. I think we can fundamentally build good product and kind of a fresh view on good product, right? And Gas was kind of our initial MVP and laying ground for this. And I think the obvious next growth step is to, increase throughput, increase the robustness of the protocol, allow permissionless access to liquidity provisioning and et cetera within the protocol to, in short, actually build it into a real and proper bridge, right? And again, competing in bridging is like super hard. So I think, just building another bridge doesn't cut it, right? And so we've been spending a lot of time on working and trying to understand the product problem first, because I'm confident that the tech exists to some extent. Somebody has a solution for us or some version of a solution for us that will work for like the actual technical interop solution, for supporting a product like this. But the thing I think that we can do is build better experiences for people interacting with all these chains and within these protocols, right? People will do the hard part. The hard part is doing the technical solution, right? Like I don't envy that at all. Like that's the hard part here. This is arguably the easy part, and also why I'm kind of like I've like looked around a bit. I'm just like, there's not a lot of other people doing it. Like everyone just kind of slaps up the Uniswap box and is like, here's a drop down of 20 chains. Go ahead and bridge, right? And I'm trying to think through what is the actual evolution of a user traversing chains with different assets. What do they want? How do they want to get there? What does that experience look like to them? What is the desired experience? And like, what is the next evolution of the UX of a bridge, right? And I think a lot of people probably disagree with me that like, it needs to change, right? They're like, well, like it works and like, we have it and like it's cool and whatnot, right? But like maybe there's a world there's 3,000 chains, right? And if that's and maybe like a lot of them are actually used, not likely, but like maybe. And like if so, like how does someone actually manage their assets across all these places? Convert them different place to another, manage this, like the user flow of it is going to get like absolutely chaotic if it hasn't already, right? So functionally, I think at the end of the day, we want to continue to build good product that I think further increases the process that a user takes when it comes to, I have money on 10 different chains. I want to go to 5 other chains. I want to consolidate them back to one chain. I want to go over here. I want to go to this new thing that just launched an hour ago, whatever, right? How do you actually build that into an application? How do you build that into a user-facing application that the user comes and they don't shoot themselves in the foot, they're not scared, they don't think it's a black box, and fundamentally you solve the problems that they need, right? You have everything there for them. So yeah, we're really focusing on, I think, building user-facing product over, the technical end of it, which is like maybe a bit, I talk about like the technical and like Interop stuff a lot, right? But that's like not the, I talk about it to the extent of I want to understand it all because I ultimately want to build something on this, right? But like that's not where I think we necessarily excel at. I think the thing that we can compete on is actually building a product and delivering it into the hands of the users that solve it in a way where we have used this stuff and we understand, the average pain points that a user goes through when they're dealing with, even these middle tail type chains, right? And I want to give you the most pleasurable experience when it comes to navigating and traversing all of these chains that I think will continue to persist in the future, right?
Yeah, I mean, 3-4 years into the bridging endgame or like the bridging ecosystem, and the bridging problem is still ever present, right? So it feels great to listen to you just like talking about this problem as if it was just discovered yesterday and you want to build a solution to overcome this. And I wish you the best, and I'm really also looking forward to the gas integration on Jumper and LIFI, right? So I feel like that's going to be another unlock for you guys and for us and for our users. So definitely looking forward to it, and all the best for the next upgrade of gas.
Thank you, sir. And likewise, the big Jumper user, anytime I got something and I'm like, hey, I want like this route and chain, I'll let you guys know. I said this like a week ago. I was like, hey, like these 2 routes would be sick if they were in Jumper, right? And you guys got back to me like 12 hours later. You're like, okay, yeah, they're there. And I'm like, oh, sick. I don't need to like leave Jumper now for this thing. Like, cool. So likewise, sir, it's been a pleasure. I have been a long time reader of your posts, your research. So I think, this has been great, and appreciate you having us here and, letting us jam.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for your time.